There comes a point when you stop asking yourself, how can I make this person change? And you finally start asking, what is this doing to me? I had spent years believing that if I became a better wife, if I was more affectionate, if I was more submissive, if I prayed harder, if I just tried a little bit more, maybe everything would finally get better. But by this point, I wasn't trying to save my marriage anymore. I was trying to figure out how to save myself. And I had no idea just how serious things were about to become. Because before I could leave, I had to find the courage to tell someone what was really happening. By this point, there was no denying that what I was dealing with was serious. For years, I had brushed so many things off. I told myself he was being childish. I told myself maybe he had simply had a difficult upbringing. Maybe he didn't know how to communicate. Maybe he was just stubborn. Maybe I was taking things too seriously. But then he said something that I couldn't explain away anymore. He told me that I didn't deserve the same respect that he did. And I remember being completely flabbergasted. Because how do you build a life with someone who doesn't even believe you deserve the same basic respect they expect for themselves? And then I remembered something else he had told me. He said he thought I was perfect, until he saw me make a mistake. And after that, everything went downhill. That sentence stayed with me, because it helped me understand something. I wasn't failing at becoming the woman he wanted me to be. The standard itself kept moving. One of the biggest things I learned during that time: control doesn't always look like someone telling you what to do. Sometimes it looks like making you question your own judgment. Sometimes it looks like turning every disagreement into a character flaw. Sometimes it looks like convincing you that peace will only come if you stop questioning. Stop disagreeing. Stop speaking. Just do what you're told. And when you finally become quiet enough, the relationship can look peaceful from the outside. But inside, you've disappeared. I had spent years trying to become easier to live with. I didn't realize I was slowly becoming less like myself. Everything I was learning from Dr. Ramini's videos sounded familiar. The manipulation, the blame shifting, the lack of accountability, the constant confusion, the walking on eggshells, the way every disagreement somehow became my fault. I was living these things in my day-to-day life. And I wanted out. But I also knew I couldn't just announce that I thought he was a narcissist. First, he already thinks I'm the problem. And second, I knew confronting him with a label wasn't going to solve anything. What I needed was help understanding me. Why did I stay? Why did I accept things I once swore I would never accept? And most importantly, how was I going to get myself out? I told him I needed help because there was something wrong and I wanted to go to therapy. I didn't tell him everything I was thinking. I knew he didn't really believe in therapy. And sure enough, he wanted to have a say in who I saw. He told me he wanted to help me choose my therapist because he didn't want someone putting things in my head. I knew he really didn't want someone outside of him giving me perspective on life. So I went to therapy. Alone. And those conversations helped me see something I couldn't see clearly before. I didn't have to figure out whether he would ever change. I had to decide what I was willing to continue living with. When I got home, he wanted to see a picture of my therapist. I showed him her socials, and he said he didn't like her spirit. I asked him to help me find one that he liked, and he started getting angry, saying he didn't understand why Christians were charging for therapy. He made the whole moment about his frustration with therapists charging money to help people and stormed out of the room. I knew then he wasn't serious about my well-being. Eventually, I sat down with him and started talking about what was happening in our relationship. I told him I wasn't comfortable with the way things were. I felt like he liked the image of me he created and who he thought I was, but he didn't really like the real me. I told him I wasn't being respected as a person. But instead of hearing what I was saying, he went right back to authority. Submission. God. My responsibility as a wife was to submit to his authority. I told him I wasn't talking about authority. I said, I feel like you don't respect me as a human being, as a person. And his response told me more than any argument ever could. To him, Respect and authority were one and the same. His authority meant he didn't have to respect me. Authority meant I was supposed to respect and submit to him. And submission meant he could treat me however he wanted, and I was supposed to accept it. That's when something inside me became very clear. We weren't simply misunderstanding each other all this time. I had been trying to have conversations with mutual respect, while he was trying to establish control. He told me that I needed to get right with God, and complained that he hadn't felt loved or cared for over the years. I told him if that's true, we probably shouldn't stay together. Because if you genuinely believe your spouse doesn't love or care for you, why would you want to stay with them? But then, he told me about one more situation involving another woman that he claims came onto him. She called me to apologize, though. I met her over coffee, and she told me the part of the story he didn't want me to know about. And he called and called and called to try and interrupt our meeting. When I got home, he wanted to know what she had said. This time, something in me was different. I wasn't scrambling to figure out what I had done wrong. I was watching him, listening. And when I went in for more details about his story and how this woman ended up in our bedroom, his story changed. That first change was one thing, but when I addressed it and asked which one was true, he said he couldn't remember. And that's when I realized I wasn't confused anymore. I was watching him lie, all the while trying to convince me that I was the one that got it mixed up, all because I was finally asking questions. After I told him we needed to talk about separating, he asked me to go for a drive so we could talk. And honestly, I was terrified. By then, I had seen enough anger and intimidation that I didn't feel comfortable having that conversation in a car. He'd used the car as a weapon before, driving recklessly to try and scare me, I guess. But I went. And he started talking about God, the church, the people we had helped, the lives we had touched, and how he didn't believe God wanted our family separated. And then he said something that stuck with me.
I'm not letting you go. We're family. That's like a mom saying she's going to separate from her child. You don't separate from your family.
I was deeply disturbed, but I kept it to myself. I just rode quietly until we got back home. His trauma showed up in a way I had never seen before. Why is our marriage being compared to a mother-child relationship? This isn't a conversation about whether we should separate. This is a conversation about whether he will allow me to leave. And I wasn't confident that I would be able to get away from him safely. Over the next several days, things became even more intense. I watched him continue to belittle me, blame other people for his actions, expect everyone around him to keep him happy. The gaslighting, the blame shifting. And I was completely disgusted with what I saw. I didn't even want him touching me anymore. I couldn't stomach it. Not because I was trying to punish him. I simply couldn't separate the person touching me from everything I knew he had done. There had been no accountability, no real change, no meaningful apology, no evidence that the cycle was actually ending. We ended up in yet another conversation where he was attempting to convince me that he was right and I was wrong about something or another. I asked him to let me leave the room because I needed a break and I wasn't able to continue the conversation with how I was feeling in that moment. He started screaming at me, telling me to shut up, over and over again. I quietly asked to leave the room as not to escalate the situation any further, and I guess he didn't like that. His fist was raised, and he began punching the dresser, as he yelled at me to shut up. I stopped asking to leave the room, waited for a moment where I could just slip past him and reach the door. He continued yelling as I left the room, calling me names, telling me this was my fault. If I had only shut up like he asked me to, he wouldn't have had to do that. That day, I knew that there was a possibility that things could get worse. And he knew it too. He suggested that we fast together. Pray. Let God deal with whatever was happening. And I was willing to pray. I was willing to seek God. But I wasn't willing to pretend everything was okay. 3 days passed. Nothing changed. After we ended the fast, he tried to make a move on me. I still couldn't. I was completely and entirely disgusted with him. I told him I wasn't in the mood. He said he thought after fasting that I would hear from God and submit to my husband. Again, I told him, I'm sorry, I'm just not in the mood. And that made him mad. I gathered my pillow and a blanket and left the room. As I walked away, he called me names and punched the nightstand. I started asking myself, how do I get out of this safely? I had no job. We had a joint bank account. We had children. And I didn't want him to know where I was going. I needed somewhere I could breathe. Somewhere I could think. Somewhere I could make decisions without somebody standing over me, criticizing my thoughts before I even had a chance to think them. When I finally started reaching out, I discovered I had family, friends, people who had seen pieces of what was happening, people who were willing to help. And suddenly, leaving didn't feel completely impossible anymore.